I feel like women have lost their empathy for their children. Society depends upon healthy children that grow into healthy adults. There is nothing more important than raising children. What happens in those first 3 years casts such a long shadow on the rest of your child's life. If you think of it in those terms, then you say whatever sacrifices we have to make in those first 3 years are worth it.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Lila Rose podcast. I told some of you guys about our new guest for today's episode on the live stream that we did on Friday in studio with Trent Horn, and I think some of you are very excited about this episode. It is with Erica Komisar, who is a clinical social worker, a psychoanalyst, and a parent guidance expert. I first learned about Erica by reading her book. I think my sister recommended it to me a few years ago, called Being There, Why Prioritizing Motherhood in the First 3 Years Matters. And I remember reading her book, and I don't remember if it was pre-children. I'm pretty sure it was pre-children, or very on the cusp when we were starting our family 4 or 5 years ago now, that I was deeply encouraged by the book, also convicted by the book about, you have to be there in the first 3 years of your child's life. And so we're going to get into the practicalities. Erica's done extensive research on this about what that means. Already, I'm sure a lot of people have a lot of questions hearing me talk about this, because there's a lot of working moms in the world today. There's a lot of working moms who listen to this show. There's a lot of moms who wonder, am I giving my kids what I need? Can I give them the time that they need? What do they need? And I want to first just start off by saying this is not to shame or to judge anyone, to make you feel bad about your life. This is to lean on Erica's extensive expertise and her experience and her practical advice to help all of us maximize our current life circumstances so we can be the best parents, mothers in particular. We can be a very young and beautiful children. If you don't have kids yet, I'm sure many of you are interested in this. I know I was before kids, because you're thinking about, how do I do life? If I'm working, do I still work when I have kids? I need to help provide for my family. I know it's a little different for men, obviously, because we don't have that same bond as men with children that mothers do. So this is certainly about that unique bond that mothers have, but there's implications for men too. So hang in there, men. You need to listen to this too. But Erica, thank you so much for joining the podcast and coming in from New York today.
Thank you for having me.
How was the flight?
It was wonderful, and I'm happy to be here in beautiful California.
Good. Well, we're so happy to have you. I'm thrilled to have you in studio. And, for starters, I shared very briefly the name of your book. I know you've written a second book, but give us a little bit about your background.
Well, I'm a psychoanalyst, and I'm a social worker, and I'm an author. So I have, for many years, treated parents and treated children, and I basically took what I learned in those more than 30 years of experience, and I put it into both of my books. Because you can't treat everyone, and I wanted to give that wisdom to people who might never cross my path and come into my office.
So what motivates you going down this particular line of research and therapy too, helping mothers in particular and working parents and stay-at-home parents be the best parents they can be? What's motivating that for you?
Well, my history, if you will, is that I was first a social worker, and I worked in a clinic in Brooklyn, and I worked with very poor families and mothers and children, and sometimes foster mothers, a lot of foster mothers and children. And what I was seeing is that many, many mothers didn't have just basic skills in terms of parenting, didn't have mothering, parenting skills. And so that got me on a track to really start psychoeducational classes for mothers. And so that's how I got into parent guidance, really. But the path that I'm on now in terms of, dealing with 0 to 3 was because I was seeing, when I started my practice over 30 years ago, I was seeing like a tidal wave, this epidemic of mental illness in children and adolescents coming at me. I was seeing an uptick in children younger and younger being diagnosed for things like ADHD and behavioral problems and early signs of aggression, and being medicated as young as 2 and 3 years of age. And I was seeing adolescents who were, where the suicide rates were going up increasingly. And I became really interested in why that was happening. And in my practice, I was seeing it connected to the absence of mothers on a day-to-day basis in children's lives, meaning the children who seemed to have the greatest problems that were coming into my practice were the children whose mothers were the most absent, either physically absent or physically and emotionally absent. And so I started doing research. I started looking at all of the neuroscience research from the 90s and up to date, as well as epigenetics and attachment research and psychoanalytic theory. And I put it together. There is a field called neuropsychobiology, which is the coming together of all those sciences to really talk about the mental health of children, and not just to keep putting out fires, which is what I was doing in my practice, but to try to talk to parents about prevention, which is how do you raise emotionally, mentally healthy children from the beginning, because the foundation is the first 3 years and it really matters. And so I really wanted to write books that helped also preventatively.
Did having your own children, I heard earlier, we were chatting a little bit, you have 3 children. Did having your own children also impact the research that you were doing or make you more interested in the research that you were doing?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. As someone in the field, I obviously was very, very interested in children and very interested in child development. But I've always had just an incredible amount of empathy. I think, you'd say I didn't develop empathy because I'm a social worker and a psychoanalyst. I'm a social worker and a psychoanalyst because I had this incredible empathy. So my empathy always extended very much to the most vulnerable and those without a voice, and that would be infants and toddlers. And so, as my husband always says to me, writing these books was giving a voice to children, because our society is very fixed on the needs of parents. It's very fixed on the needs of mothers. If you look at all the articles that are written and a lot of the books, it's all about parents and what do we need to do for parents and how can we help parents and what do parents need to be happy. But no one was really writing anything about what children need. And so really what I was doing was saying, look, the expression goes, you're only as happy as your least happy child, right? And so if that's true, which it is true, then parents want to raise happy, healthy children, resilient children. And so these books were really, and this information is meant, as you say, not to shame parents, but to really get them to understand what it's going to require to raise those mentally healthy, emotionally healthy children.
I think there is maybe a tendency on this adult-focused approach we have as a culture. We have that tendency because sometimes the answers are not what we would prefer culturally. The answers of what it does require to be the parent that you need to be for your kids. And in a way, there's hard truths. And I think, you do your book, I remember reading it, and it's full of empathy. It's very understanding, and I think that's how you come across. But why do you think, what is your theory? I want to start with this because it's where some people's objections may already be. Why do you think there's this, maybe a limited sort of capacity people are feeling to be able to hear, oh, my kids need something more from me that I feel that I can't or I don't want to give them?
Well, I think that my books do sometimes make women feel guilty, and I don't really see guilt as a bad thing, whereas the rest of society does see guilt as a bad thing, because for me, guilt is a signal feeling. So basically what it says is you're in conflict. So like physical pain is another signal feeling. If you hurt yourself, you break your ankle hiking or playing basketball or whatever, you're going to stop. You're going to go to the doctor. You're going to take it easy. You're going to look at your ankle. You're not going to keep playing basketball on your ankle, right? It's a signal feeling. So we say guilt is a signal feeling that you're in conflict, and you're meant to look at that conflict and resolve it in whatever way you resolve it. But you're not meant to turn away from it. And society tells women, no, turn away from it. Guilt's not good. And, excessive guilt is what we say is neurotic, is not good. But guilt is actually very helpful. It means our conscience is working. So we don't want to just turn away from our guilt. And guilt is about behavior. So we feel badly, we feel conflicted about behaviors that we may not be happy about, that we are engaged in. Shame is a different thing. So shame has to do with character. Shame means that you feel like a bad person. So if the things that I'm saying make you feel ashamed, it has nothing to do with what I'm saying. It has to do with something much deeper, something that has to do with feeling like a bad person. But that doesn't have to do with the guilt over leaving your child, which has to do with behavior. And so, they're both important feelings, guilt and shame. But I think we don't like to feel any discomfort. And so, sometimes we have to feel discomfort to grow. We have to feel discomfort to do the right thing. Sometimes doing the right thing is uncomfortable. And I think that we don't like feeling uncomfortable today.
In your introduction to your book, Being There, Why Prioritizing Motherhood in the First 3 Years Matters, you wrote, "The truth is we can do everything in life, but not at the same time." I think there was a famous Atlantic article, Why Women Can't Have It All. Mm-hmm. Was it Ann Savage was her name? Why we can't have it all, at least not at the same time. And you go on to say, we cannot raise healthy children if we are not there for them, physically and emotionally. We cannot be present for them while being intensely involved with work or other interests that make us less mindful of and attentive to the emotional needs of our children. Now, the rest of the book, of course, unpacks this. So let's unpack it. Let's start with the current status quo of working parents and families. You saw this. This is what got you into this line of research to begin with. You saw children suffering. What are some of the statistics you can share about how many mothers are working right now and the different ways that children are being raised and the outcomes that they're experiencing?
Well, how many mothers are working? I think in America, and I get confused with the statistics because I work a lot in Europe too, but I think it's 80%. So a lot of women work.
Full-time or some form of work.
Yeah, some form of work. And what was the other question you asked?
Oh, and to clarify, obviously all mothers work.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Child rearing, but we're talking about employment outside of the home significant employment outside of the home. What have you seen? You saw some of these trends in your own practice, but in terms of the quality of children, their mental health outcomes, their emotional outcomes, after the first 3 years, how do you see the correlation between big picture, mothers increasingly out of the home and children and their outcomes of not having their mothers for quality and quantity time?
Yeah, well, the Pew Research Organization did a study to show that working mothers spend on average no more than 90 minutes a day with their children under the age of 1, I think. And just simply put, it's just not enough time to raise healthy children. And what I mean by that is children are born neurologically vulnerable. That's really important because I think that we project onto very young children that they are more capable, that they're more resilient, that they're more independent and more self-sufficient than they actually are. They're actually incredibly neurologically and emotionally vulnerable. There is the idea that they are born too early, that they should probably be inside of us for another 8 to 9 months. And so, they're born in the world meant to be on our bodies. So in other parts of the world, mothers wear babies on their bodies for the first year as if they're still in the womb. And there's a reason for that, because mothers serve in the first year as the central nervous system to babies. So when we take a baby out of our body and then within 6 weeks, we put it in daycare into a group environment with strangers and we remove it from our body, or we put it in a crib in a separate room than our room, or we let the baby cry it out at 3 months, what we're essentially doing is we are putting stress on a neurological system that's not meant to deal with stress. It's meant to be buffered from stress. So mothers they serve a few really important biological functions in the first 3 years. One is they buffer children from stress. 2 is they regulate children's emotions from moment to moment. Every time a mother soothes a baby or has skin-to-skin contact with the baby, she's basically regulating that baby's emotions and getting that baby's emotions from going too high and too low to a state of homeostasis. And that's really important because babies' brains are not meant to be under a great amount of stress. very small incremental amounts, but not a great amount of stress. So the cortisol levels or the stress hormone levels in babies' brains are meant to remain very, very, very low in the first 12 months. And what we're doing is by separating them from us precociously and prematurely and putting them into these daycare situations, we're essentially exposing them to very high levels of stress. The problem with that is that when we turn a stress system on, a stress regulating system on, before it's meant to be turned on, because it's meant to really be offline for the first year, when we turn it on too early, it becomes the amygdala, this little tiny almond-shaped part of the brain that regulates stress in the brain, starts to grow and becomes highly active when it's not supposed to. And sort of like a light bulb in the kitchen or a balloon that gets overblown, it basically blows out and shrivels up. And when that happens, it ceases to be functional in the future, which is why you have things like ADHD, which is not a disorder, by the way, but which is a hypervigilance of the brain on stress. It's a child's brain on stress. It's the flight response of the fight or flight evolutionary response to stress. As human beings, we either fight our predators that are running after us or we flee from them. And ADHD is the flight part, and the aggression that we're seeing in children at a very young age in school. Children who are put into daycare at a very young age either become aggressive in daycare or when they get to primary school, there's high levels of aggression. That's the fight part. So we're basically turning on stress in our children's brain before they're supposed to have stress. And then the brain doesn't regulate the stress going forward, meaning it can't regulate emotions, it can't deal with adversity, bad stuff.
So when you have, your 2-year-old tantrum, how does one navigate that? Let's say separate from whether this child's being fully raised by a stay-at-home mom, part-time working mom, part-time nanny, but let's just say the child's tantruming. Is it possible for the child to experience a lot of stress at 2 or 3, even act out violently, hit their sibling or something like this, and that's a natural form of development as opposed to there's been some sort of trauma or an absence of care that child needed?
Right. So tantrums are normal. Tantrums are, what I would say is tantrums are like emotional blown fuses. So, and that's quite different than the kind of aggression that we're seeing in children when they're in daycare or when they're neglected, right? So, the aggression we're seeing would be more under the kind of the category of behavioral problems. Tantrums aren't behavioral problems. Tantrums are blown fuses. Essentially, what happens is between the ages of 2 and 3. Children start to internalize rules and structure. So before then, until about 18 months, babies are, you give them what they need, you meet their needs. If they cry, you pick them up, they're not being potty trained. They really don't have many rules, so to speak. And then we start to say no to them. And then they start to say no back to us because that's what happens. They mimic us. We say no, they say no, no, no. And so that internalizing of structure causes them to be in great conflict, and that causes tantrums. So it's conflict. So tantrums aren't the end of the world. Some children are more neurologically sensitive. So what we know from the research is that there are many, many children born with a gene they found for sensitivity, and sensitivity means sensitivity to stress. Those children who are born with that sensitivity gene are more likely to have tantrums. They're more likely to cry and be harder to soothe. And we've all had one of those children. If you have many children, and I always say to mothers, raise your hand if you have one child who's more sensitive, who's harder to soothe, and, is more sensitive with touch. And everybody raises their hand. I have one, maybe I have 2. But those children, the research shows, if those children are given sensitive, empathic nurturing from their mothers, if their mothers are physically and emotionally present, and if they are very empathic and sensitive, it neutralizes the expression of that gene. So those children have as great a chance of being emotionally healthy later on as children born without that gene. If those children are not given that sensitive, empathic nurturing, if they're put in daycare, those children then go on to develop things like anxiety, depression, ADHD.
So you've mentioned daycare a few times now, and I want to go through this exercise, which again, I think is very controversial today, but I think it's incredibly important, and I so value the work you've done on this exercise of the varying styles, I will call them. I know in many cases it can feel like a necessity, or it can be a necessity. So I'm not trying to make light of it by calling it a style, but the various ways of managing, let's call it childcare, raising of one's very young children.
Yeah.
Daycare obviously is on one part, where you drop your child off at a daycare, sometimes 10 to 12 hours a day, depending on the career, or I don't know if there's more, but I've definitely heard 10 to 12. And then we're going to go all the way to stay-at-home mom who has no work or really many activities outside of raising this child. Because there are stay-at-home moms who have a lot of hobbies, activities, social life that takes them out of the home. There's jobs that have varying degrees of taking you out of the home. I want to go through all of it. Talk about nannies too, aloparenting, grandparents. You get into all of this in the book and talk about the different pros and cons, which I think people need to know. So the purpose of this is to give people the evidence-based research, the facts about how these different forms of dealing with childcare impact kids.
Yeah.
So are you ready for this exercise?
Yes.
I know you've done this many times.
So you guys, I'm very picky about my skincare. I always have been. I tried a lot of products, high-end products, low-end products, all different kinds of products over the years. And it's been very hard for me to find a line that I like, multiple products, and I'll keep using. And that's why I'm so excited to share about Nimi Skincare. Nimi Skincare first caught my eye because it's a beautiful brand. They've got great sourcing of their ingredients, but they're also a pro-life, pro-family company. So when I tried their product for the first time, I was surprised to discover that I love using Nimi Skincare. I love their moisturizer, which I use every night. I love using their vitamin C scrub. I love using their sunscreen. They have all kinds of other products. I think you're going to love Nimi Skincare. Give them a try. It's NimiSkincare.com. That's N-I-M-I, NimiSkincare.com. And for the holidays, you can use the code Lila at checkout for 15% off your order. That's NimiSkincare.com. Support a pro-life, pro-family company. Try some amazing product and use the code Lila at checkout for 15% off your order. That's NimiSkincare.com.
Yeah. All right, so how shall we start? Maybe start with, if you could, the optimal, what you see to be the optimal way to raise a child for maximum positive outcomes, a very young child.
Well, what I say is more is more. The more emotionally and physically present you can be for your children in the first critical period of brain development, which is 0 to 3, the greater the chance your child will be mentally healthy. And having a primary attachment figure, because attachment security is really what we're talking about. So having a primary attachment figure available to you to soothe you when you're in distress and help bring you back to that homeostasis whenever you need it. As you're starting to explore the world, to be able to come and touch base with that, secure object and be able to then go off and toddle and explore again. That's the ideal. And I think it's hard because, we're not allowed to talk about the ideal today in anything. I don't know when that happened because, if things are less than ideal, often they're easier to deal with if first we understand what the ideal is, right? So if we can't talk about the ideal, we can't repair, we can't work through and resolve the conflicts that come from the less than the ideal. So the ideal is having your primary attachment figure, usually your mother, as present as possible in those, but not just physically present, because as I say, you can be physically present and be emotionally checked out. You can't be emotionally present if you're not physically present. It's just not happening. So the idea of quality time is a ruse. It's a myth. It doesn't work for children. They need both your physical presence and your emotional presence. That's the ideal. If you can't be there,
I want to actually sit with the ideal for a moment more, because I agree with you. It's not talked about enough.
No.
In some circles, it is talked about. Stay-at-home mom in the context of the ideal for child rearing. It's like stay-at-home mom is the best. Okay, well, what does that mean? How does that mean? What does it mean to be the ideal stay-at-home mom for your kids? What do those activities look like? So I want to unpack that a little more. Mm-hmm. You mentioned quality and quantity time. There's a difference between the two. As you said, I think in your book, children need both. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's start with the quantity word, because I think that's the most sticky for people. Mm-hmm. I think, I don't know if it's 144 hours in a week, if I have that number correct. Mm-hmm. Waking hours for a child is, I don't know if it's 80. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I remember doing this exercise, by the way, I think after reading your book. Quantity. So for that mother, when you say the more is more, Is it ideal then for a mother, if she has activities outside the home, even grocery shopping, okay, we're just doing the ideal exercise here, or she has friends, or she has, she works out, she does, whatever those activities are, is the ideal the child accompanies for all of it during waking hours?
Well, again, if you look at other parts of the world, mothers wear their babies. It's baby wearing for the first year. And so ideal would be that you wear your baby and you carry your baby with you and your baby goes with you. There was a researcher that I interviewed for my book. Her name is Judy Mesman, and she's a very famous researcher. She goes around the world and she looks at mothering behaviors in other cultures to see if it's culturally relevant or whether it's universal. And she found in all the countries she went to, many, many, many countries, that it's universal. Mothering behavior is universal. But what she found is that babies in other parts of the world don't cry like babies in the West do, particularly in America, because we have this very strange and perverse idea that babies should be separate than us at a very young age. Whereas in other cultures, they understand that infants that are just out of your body are meant to be physically skin to skin close to you because that forms attachment security. So the ideal is for the first year, for the most part, to have your baby with you, right? And then, it doesn't mean every single minute, because the other thing that we don't do in this country is we don't raise our children in extended family situations like other parts of the world. Now, that's changing in other parts of the world, sadly, because they're following our model, and they really shouldn't because our model sucks, excuse me. But we have this kind of family diaspora where people move away from their families and they raise children in isolation. They move to the suburbs, they raise children in isolation. It's all about isolation. So this weird kind of ethos of individualism and isolation and self-sufficiency, and it's all part of our, I suppose it's part of our American culture, not the good part. I love America, but this is not the good part of our American culture, this idea that, we're all meant to live independently of one another. Actually, no, because independence is not the goal, it's interdependence. And that means that we never raise children in isolation. We always raise children with grandmothers and aunts and next door neighbors who were called aunt. And so those people could hold the baby, because that you asked about alloparenting. Alloparenting is not giving your baby to someone when they're in distress and, going out and, to the supermarket at that moment. It's giving your baby to someone who the baby knows really well, who's an alternative attachment figure, who can entertain the baby and hold the baby when the baby is in a state of homeostasis. But when the baby is in distress in other parts of the world, the baby is handed right back to the mother.
And so the mother not gone long
enough?
The
mother's not gone that long. And so,
And how long is not long?
So it depends on the baby, right? If you have a sensitive baby who really can't bear, who cries when the baby is away from you, then, you have a sensitive baby and you have to be more present. If you have a slightly less sensitive baby, and that's the individual baby God gave you, then you might be able to leave for a few more minutes, And the idea is that if you have trusted alternative attachment figures like grandmothers or a single surrogate like a babysitter, it is also important for mothers to have breaks. So this is, the other thing is that it's important for mothers to be able to take a shower, to be able to go for a walk, to be able to do a 20-minute yoga class by themselves, to be able to just not be within the sphere of the baby for a few minutes, And so that's important too. But somehow we've taken that idea of, the dance of closeness and space with a newborn baby, and we've taken it to an extreme, because don't we do everything to an extreme in America? And we've taken it to an extreme where we say, well, I can go back to work for 8 or 10 hours a day or leave my baby in daycare. And no, it sort of loses the nuance of it. So think about closeness and separation and space as a dance. And with a newborn baby, I would say there's more closeness than space. And then as the baby gets older, increasingly there's a little more space, but there's still closeness.
You mentioned alloparenting, and you said, the neighbor that's like the aunt or the sitter that's really well known, or the grandparent. It sounds like in the ideal, we're talking about the ideal again, then we're going to walk away towards reality of what people are dealing with in the day-to-day today. But in the ideal, there is an extended family unit, or there's a community at minimum that's trusted, that can form meaningful quality and quantity time bonds with very young children to be another caretaker for that child, not just to permit the mother to have space to do something else for her own care or whatever her obligations might be, but also is this good for the development of the baby?
I mean, it can be if the grandmother or the aunt or the father or whoever is watching the baby when the baby is in a calm state doesn't get possessive over the baby when they're in a distressed state. So sometimes what happens today, and I've seen this happen many times in the families I work with, is that a father will feel competitive because of all this gender neutrality, equality stuff. The father feels competitive with the mother, or the grandmother feels competitive with the mother, where she says, no, I can help the baby. I can deal with the baby's distress. Whereas the mother's saying, no, Mom, it's okay. The baby is in distress. The baby needs to be with me. So, I encourage mothers to be a little forceful with their own mothers and aunts and whoever's helping them, and babysitters, because babysitters can be quite forceful and say, no, I'll take the baby. And I'm like, no. If the baby's in distress, really in distress, that baby goes back to the mother, who is the primary attachment figure, because that is the go-to person when that baby is in distress. So that kind of competitiveness is also something that you want to make sure it doesn't exist in your family.
And so we're talking right now, when you say the baby, I think we're talking largely the first year of life.
Yeah.
All right. What about when the baby hits 2?
Yeah.
My 2-year-old, we still call him the baby sometimes.
Yeah.
They're still very, very little.
So little. So the right brain, 85% of the right brain is developed at the age of 3. So between 0 to 3, that's the critical window. So the first year is a year of really the height of neurological vulnerability. But the next 2 years, so it's interesting, people get the idea of attachment security confused. They think attachment security happens after a few days, a few weeks, a few months, I can go back to work at 3 months because my baby's fully attached. And I'm like, no, the baby is bonded with you. But attachment security takes a good 3 years of repeat, reassurance. So every time the baby goes off to toddle off, and that's why they call it toddling, they toddle off to explore the physical world, and they take risks, they're actually looking back at their mothers for security to know if they should keep going, or they'll come back and get a hug. It's what Margaret Mahler, a very famous psychoanalyst, called rapprochement, or emotional refueling. So that emotional refueling process, which is reassurance, repeat, is the foundation of attachment security. It's not one and done. It's not, I made the baby bond to me, now the baby's great. No, it's actually reassuring the baby over and over again till the baby internalizes the idea that the world is a secure place and the environment can be trusted, and you're the environment.
So what does that practically look like in terms of how one spends one's time, quality and quantity time, with a 2 to 3-year-old?
So I think it's really important, because we don't live in extended family situations, unless you do.
We're talking about the ideal here.
Yeah, that you have friends. If you're not living near your family, that you have friends, and those friends have babies, and you're getting together, and it's not for the babies, mind you. The babies are not needing stimulation. That's also a myth, that babies under the age of 3 need to get together in group situations, and they just don't, because they do something called parallel play. They don't really care about anybody but you. But as a mother, so you don't lose your mind, it's important that you have stimulation too, and it's important that you have other adults around that support you and tell you you're doing a good job and you can compare notes with. And so I always encourage mothers groups. Like, I think mothers groups are really, really important, where mothers and babies, and there's all kinds of things that we've done with it. Mothers massage, baby massage groups, or jamboree classes, or music classes, or those are more for mothers than they are for the babies, and they stimulate the babies a little too, but sometimes they overstimulate the babies. The truth is they're for the mothers. So I think mothers need other mothers. I think that is the truth, that we need to have a support system. We need to have a community. And we've lost that community in raising children. And so one of the reasons that mothers do get postpartumly depressed, I mean, there's many reasons why mothers get postpartumly depressed, but one is the isolation. And one is that the expectation is that we're supposed to sit in our homes in the suburbs alone and raise children in isolation. And that's just never the way it was. It's not the way it's meant to be. We're meant to live in villages and communities. We're meant to have people around us that support us and hug us and put their arm around us and tell us we're doing a great job as a mother, and breastfeeding's hard, but you go, girl, you're doing a great job. And we've lost that. We've really lost the community that was part of raising children. So I think community is a very important part of mothers being happy as mothers. And also, so the idea of being in your house all day with your child alone, although some of that does feel nice and feels kind of cocooning, I think it's got to be intermingled with kind of socializing with other mothers and interacting and having a community.
So for those, we talked about year one, which largely the advice is, wear the baby, take the baby everywhere.
That's it.
And, I'm thinking right now in context of, say, the working mom myself. My first year, I had pandemic baby with my first one. The second one was kind of a semi-pandemic baby. A lot of it, the work I did do, baby was right there or on my lap, and there was typing going on or phone calls or whatever. The second year, though, is different. Your baby is exploring. Your baby is not just sleeping as many hours a day, still is napping, but there's a lot more needs and interests that little now toddler has. What is the, back to ideal? So it sounds like the ideal for babies 2 to 3, we talked about, before that, the ideal is if the mother is doing other things, she's still taking the baby, the toddler now.
I mean, I was asked to get involved in Australia with a co-working situation where you could bring your children with you, and you could have toys in the center, and you could have a couple of mothers helpers, not nannies, mothers helpers, where the mothers are still around a circle, in their separate cubicles, but the babies can play and have the mother's helper caregivers in the center, but come to the mothers when they're in distress. And so I thought that was a really interesting idea. It was sort of a circular office with mothers in cubicles and babies in the middle and so, bring your baby to work. I mean,
but could that fit within the ideal? Because in that situation, she's got to focus. I mean,
right.
Let's be real.
Right.
Let's be real. Most jobs require some level of focus.
So the ideal is probably to be with your baby as much as possible in the first 3 years. And if you're going to work, then it would be to have a single surrogate caregiver, a nanny or a babysitter, if you don't have kinship bonds. So the first would be kinship bonds. It would be a grandmother or an aunt. If you don't have kinship bonds, it would be a single surrogate caregiver. And then after that, it would be sharing a caregiver when you have to work. It's an interesting question that I'm asked a lot. Is it better to have another person there that's with the baby when you're working, or to be working and distracted and not paying attention to the baby? And the reality is it's better to have a mother's helper or someone with you that can pay attention to the baby and while you're on the phone or have to do your work part-time or whatever you're doing. So rather than doing your work and ignoring the baby. So that's probably not great in terms of how the baby, because the problem is when we're really intensely working, it's very hard to pick up on the cues of babies. Babies don't need attention every single minute. Babies it's a dance. They need attention, and then they need space. And you'll see if you have a baby, they look away, they suck their thumb, they look at the light. Sometimes they're very happy lying on the floor looking at their mobile. They need space too. But when they look back, if you are looking at your phone or at your computer, that baby feels lost, right? So it's the idea of, I can't be staring at my baby all day, but I have to be tuned enough in that when the baby is looking at me, I know the baby's looking at me, right? So it's probably better then to have somebody with you, a mother's helper, I call them. You could even have a young girl, who's playing with the baby, sort of like aloparenting. That's what they do in other countries. You might have other family members or young family members playing with the baby. so the mother can, peel the potatoes or is in the fields picking, vegetables, and their little brother is playing with them. And then when the baby's in distress, the baby has access to the mother. That would be the ideal.
So shooting forward again to the 2-year-old, so that 2-year-old and staying in the realm of the ideal again, and then we're going to ease out of this realm to more of the practical realities. But let's say, does it fit within the ideal, based on the research that you've done, for a mother to work part-time with a 2+ year, let's say a 2-year-old or whatever, but it's from home largely? If she leaves the 2-year-old, it's for how many hours can still fit within the ideal?
Well, you have to look for the signs that it's too much for your individual child. And what I would say is that, this is a silly formula, and I don't like to give it to people, but I'll give it to you since you asked, because I don't like to give specific times because it depends on the baby. But I would say take the age of the baby and say you can't leave them more than that number of hours a day.
So if you've got a 2-year-old, don't leave them for more than 2 hours a day would be the number you would say.
That's it.
And
then if you've got a 3-year-old, 3 hours a day.
And if you've got a particularly needy 2-year-old, that might be less. Would you say it's more for some, or you would say really stick close to that?
I would say stick close to that.
And then back to the ideal for the 3-year-old. It sounds like similar application. What you just gave us, that rubric for the 2-year-old, you would give for the 3-year-old.
Yeah, and then by the time they go into nursery school, well, we used to call it nursery school, now we call it preschool, I guess. I wouldn't do anything at the age of 3 over 3 days a week for a few hours a day.
3 hours a day.
Yeah.
It would be that
rule of thumb again. No more than that, because there's a lot of... So what happened with childcare, it's really childcare because it's not school, is that it was supply and demand. So, 30 years ago, nursery schools did not offer children under the age of 3 anything, because they said a child shouldn't be in a school situation until they're 3, and then only a few hours a day, a few days a week when they're 3. And then, because they used to do half days, right? They would say 3 days a week, you want the mornings or the afternoons, they'd say. That's all the preschools did. And then at 4, they'd say, okay, we'll do 5 hours a day, 5 days a week to get them ready for kindergarten, right? And so that was what it was. And then supply and demand, mothers wanted to work, so it became daycare. And they started taking children and, they started prostituting themselves, if you ask me. It's a terrible word I'm using, but I'm going to say that. For money, they started doing what was developmentally incorrect for children, which is they started taking children younger and younger and calling it school.
I want to get into objections and then practical ways to live out what's healthiest for a child with other competing needs and demands. But I want to go back to the ideal one more time and lay it out, because this is controversial. And, people know I work. Now, I'm very blessed to have this work from home gig. I work for a very friendly organization, and my podcast, I do it on my time. But I have time away from my kids. Obviously, I'm here. My children are not in the room. And if they were, it might not be developmentally appropriate or good for them.
That's right.
But I do want us to really let the ideal that you're presenting here, based on the research that you've done, be clear. I want it to be clear.
Well,
because I think we sometimes, because we know this can make people uncomfortable. We know that it can be challenging. And for some people, they feel it's not even possible, so it feels depressing to them. We don't even want to say what the ideal fully is, but I want to you've laid it out. I want to just make sure it's clear. First year of life, be there.
Yep.
Wear that baby as much as you physically can. And if you're gone 20 minutes, maybe up to an hour. But if the baby's crying, get back to that baby.
Yep.
Because you are the one that's going to soothe that child, not the sitter.
And I advocate,
not even the husband.
And I advocate for paid leave for a full year in this country. I've been trying for years, and I was trying to use the book for that. I still try to use the book for that. It's really hard in a country that isn't willing to put the money where its mouth is.
They do that in the Netherlands and other countries up to 2 years.
3 years.
Up to 3 years. Amazing. Hungary is such a pro-family country. It's amazing. That's a very compelling point, because I've looked at Hungary's pro-family policies and gotten excited about some of the things they're doing. All right, so that's for the first year. By the time they're 2, there's a little more independence. But you still, if you're going to leave that child, you want them to be with an allo parent, someone that they have some sort of bond with, that's significant, that's trusted. Ideally family, if not family, that nanny or that sitter or that neighbor that's really trusted. And then that rule of thumb, right? That don't be gone more than an hour at a time. And let's actually ask that question to be super clear here. An hour at a time. What if in the morning she has a doctor's appointment, in the afternoon she has a phone call, and there's 2 hours for that 1-year-old?
I say once in, once out, once in.
What does that mean?
Meaning every time you leave a very young child under the age of 3, it's a major loss for them. You're their entire universe. I can't emphasize it enough. You as their mother are their entire universe. They may not be your entire universe, although some mothers feel that way, but you are their entire universe. When you leave, their world falls apart, and it feels like a major loss to them, and they have no sense of the future. And they haven't internalized, many of them haven't developed object constancy, so they haven't internalized that you'll come back. And so when you leave, you've left. And so you want to make sure you don't abuse that, and you find a way to, I say, clump together your errands and things you need to do, and once out, once in. And so what's really hard on children are the mothers, and I'm from New York, and this is a thing that mothers do. They say, oh, isn't it better I'll just go out and come in and go out and come in, and I've got a yoga class, and I'm going to go make a call, and I'm going to go have lunch, and I'm going to go out to dinner tonight. And that's the worst thing for babies, because what it's like treating like babies' attachment, like it's a yo-yo. And babies are very sensitive to loss. And so the idea is babies can handle you going out. If you go out for 2 hours when they're 2, they can handle it. And they can handle it particularly if you say goodbye. You never leave without saying goodbye. Never, ever leave without saying goodbye, even if you feel guilty, especially if you feel guilty. And then you repair it right away when you come back, and you tell them when you're going to come back, and you never make a promise that you can't keep. And they start to trust you, and they say, right, mommy's coming back in 2 hours, and you leave them with a trusted, loving, sensitive, nurturing adult, a babysitter or a grandmother, right? And so they can be left for short periods of time when they're 2 and 3, as long as you don't abuse that. And I think a lot of mothers, I think I find with the work that I do, I'll be very frank with you, I think I find that mothers have lost, the original title of being there was The Lost Instinct. And I liked that title. They thought it was too technical or too scientific, but they liked being there, whatever. It's also a good title. But The Lost Instinct really said what I meant, which is that I feel like women have lost their empathy for their children. They no longer feel for their children. Something has been disrupted because of generational expression of attachment disorders in the last 75, 80 years. Something has really been disrupted in terms of mothers' ability to feel for the distress and the pain and the longing and the loss of their children.
Do you think that, you mentioned generational, I think, attachment, it's because we were raised away and we thought, well, we're fine. Yeah, we're okay. We got some issues. And so we emulate inadvertently or intentionally how we were raised. Or we see other people raising kids a certain way.
So I'm a byproduct in a good way of the women's rights movement, of the sexual revolution. And I'm a lot older than you, so I really am. I was a beneficiary of it in many ways. But the way it was structured by Gloria Steinem when it was first, conceived, was Gloria Steinem said, if you don't go out to work, you betray the movement of feminism. You betray the women's rights movement. And she said, babies will be fine. Don't worry about them. Put them into daycare. Give them to a babysitter. You need to go out to work. You need to be soldiers in this war that we're waging. And women just soaked it up, hook, line, and sinker. Meanwhile, Gloria Steinem never had children. So she could say that because she never had the conflicts of being a mother. She never felt the oxytocin pull. She never was attached to a baby. But it really, that message was very destructive because it didn't say, and now all movements there's an extreme to them when they first begin, and I guess she saw it as a war. But it was a war that was waged not just against men. Unfortunately, it was a war that was waged against babies. And that is really what happened, because then women, for generations after, so what we know is that attachment disorders are passed down generationally. So if you develop an attachment disorder because your mother isn't emotionally present for you, or, is disinterested, or then that gets passed down to the next generation. So the next generation is one step away from feeling the attachments sort of to their babies. And we know this from lots of mammalian research. So yeah, we suffered a lot from that. I have a t-shirt that I love. I'm a feminist. I do helping profession work, I always have. And I have a t-shirt that says Maternal Feminism, which is that I believe in women's right to choose a career or not a career, or the ability to work, but that comes with responsibility. Freedom always comes with responsibility. And so we have a responsibility if we decide to have children. You don't have to have children to live a satisfying life. You can have a very satisfying career like Gloria Steinem did. But if you're going to have children, Penelope Leach said it many years before me. She said in her book, anybody can have a child. Don't have them if you don't want to care for them.
The holidays are almost here, and now is the time to snuggle up with a delicious steaming cup of hot coffee with your loved ones. And of course, you should be drinking 7 Weeks Coffee. 7weekscoffee.com is America's pro-life coffee company. The blends are delicious. You're going to have these delicious roasts that are gourmet. You have different kinds. I like the medium roast Ethiopian blend. There's all kinds that you can choose from. But this is ethically sourced, organic, gourmet, low-acid coffee. 7weekscoffee.com is also a pro-life company. 10% of everything that they bring in, they give to pregnancy resource centers to help moms and babies in need. So anytime you buy a 7 Weeks Coffee, a delicious bag of coffee beans, you are directly fueling the pro-life movement. So go to 7weekscoffee.com today. Order yourself a delicious bag or bags of coffee. You can use the code Lila at checkout for 10% off your order. That's 7weekscoffee.com, and you can use the code Lila for 10% off your order.
Ideal, last question, I think on Ideal. We'll probably end up back here, but what about date nights? What about, separate even from work? There's no job, but there's obligations. Girls' night, I don't know. There's time where maybe someone else is putting baby to sleep, and that routine is 3, 4, 5 hours, by the time you leave 5 p.m. and then baby's up past, 8 or I'm just saying maybe a 2-year-old. I'm trying to come up with, a scenario here, but I know even the stay-at-home moms that I know, many of them, there's still that evening out occasionally, or there's also the weekend away, with my spouse, if I'm trying to do something with them and I leave the kids with the grandparents and this is a 2-year-old, what about those scenarios?
So one, it depends on the relationship that your child has with their grandparents and how close they are. And if they aren't grandparents, if they're a trusted, loving, sensitive, empathic, nurturing babysitter. So the relationship matters, how close that relationship is to your child. And I would say don't abuse it. So date night is important because it solidifies a relationship in a marriage, which is also important, right? So it's not as if the ideal is being glued to your baby every second. It never was that. It was always that you were in an extended family community where you got support. So mostly mothers would take their babies out to the field. Even now, if you go to Africa or India or Asia and you go into the fields, you'll see mothers with babies on their bodies and they're picking vegetables and they have their 2-year-old there. It's all done, much of the much with their babies. But the reality is you can go out on a date night for a couple of hours. It's the idea of just not abusing it and being sensitive to the child you have. If you have a very sensitive baby, then one night a week out with your spouse is it. I always say that when you go out at night, it's some of the hardest time for children, young children. And because it's a transition time. So the hardest time for all children, but even more for sensitive children, are transition times. That means waking up in the morning. That means going to sleep at night. Those are the two big ones. And then all the transitions during the day, when you go to work or when you come back from work or when they go to school or when they come back from school. And that's consistent throughout childhood. So whether you have a 1-year-old, an 8-year-old, or a 15-year-old, they're very sensitive to transitions. Children are very sensitive to transitions. And the more sensitive, children are even more sensitive to them. So as parents, if you can be there as much as possible, physically and emotionally during those transitions. So the most important transition is waking up in the morning and going to sleep at night, right? Particularly going to sleep at night because it's when they go unconscious. And that's a very scary thing for children. And they need the person who provides them with the most security in the world present for them when they're going unconscious, because it's so scary to go unconscious. I mean, 50% of adults in America take some kind of sleep aid, whether it's Ambien or melatonin or something stronger. They drink alcohol or because they can't go unconscious because they're afraid to. No one talks about it.
So are you recommending in part that you are there while the child falls asleep?
Yes.
As opposed to good night?
Yes, absolutely. The idea that you just, again, this is part of the myth of America, that we're raising little soldiers, little independent soldiers that we put in a room and shut the door and they cry it out. I have a YouTube video, just a few minutes long, on the neurological damage that you do to your children when you make them cry it out under the age of 6 months. And even after 6 months, you have to be careful with it.
What about the 2.5-year-old who wants their back rubbed while they fall asleep every night?
Again, that's their transition. That's how they feel safe. They're telling you, I'm scared. They're not doing it to be manipulative. They're doing it because they're scared. It's also not natural for children to sleep alone. In no other culture in the world do children sleep in their own bedroom alone. They sleep in rooms full of people, adults, other children. They sleep on top of one another. They sleep in beds. When a child says to their parents that, it's not fair, Mommy, that you get to sleep with Daddy and I have to sleep in my own room alone and it's scary, they're absolutely right, because in no other culture do we force children to sleep alone like that. So this ethos of ours that it's so good to be a soldier. Actually, soldiers, when we make soldiers, they actually are more vulnerable to breakdown later on. So interestingly, it sort of backfires.
Well, I think there is a fear of coddling. There's a fear that they're going to be so dependent that I'm going to be rubbing this back at 6 years old. I've heard this expressed often. My husband and I talk about this sometimes, like, what are the ways to do this to prepare them for life? What are your thoughts on that?
So I always say to parents who come to me for parent guidance, 8-year-olds don't sleep with their parents unless there's really something wrong. So, if you're afraid that your 8-year-old will be sleeping with you every night, it doesn't happen in about 99% of the situations. Meaning children have their own organic developmental line where they're capable, and you'll know it. It's the Italians, when they're cooking spaghetti, to know whether it's cooked, they throw it against the wall. If it sticks, then they say it's cooked, and if it doesn't stick, they say, well, we'll try later. That's the attitude. So if you want to try, quote unquote, helping your child to sleep on their own, you try it. You see if they're ready. If there's a readiness to it, there might be a little kvetchiness and a little bit of crying, but it's not going to be real distress. And if it's real distress, that means that they're terrified. And so there's the lack of empathy again. The ability to, in a schizoid way, shut your door and shut out the intense distress of your child is very disturbing to me as a therapist.
What typically is the age that you think independent sleeping becomes developmentally normal?
By the age of 5, I always say to parents, until 5, you're not going to sleep. And if you do sleep, it'll be by accident. Because the truth is, whoever told you you're going to sleep at 3 months or 6 months, again, that's the myth. The truth is that between 0 and 5, there's so much happening developmentally. Even after the critical period of brain development, between 3 and 5, there's Oedipal development, which is sexual development. There's going to school for the first time. There's major separations. There's becoming more independent and being scared of becoming more independent. All of that makes children anxious and fearful. And so between 0 and 5, there's so much that happens developmentally and physically that it interrupts sleep. it doesn't interrupt it every minute. You might have a nice run and then it'll get interrupted again. So, the idea that you have to expect a lot of inconsistency for the first 5 years. After 5 years, after they get settled into kindergarten and they're about, 6 years old, life, Freud used to call it the latency period between 3 and 9. But basically, life gets pretty boring for children in a good way. If a child has a good, secure, stable environment, they're learning their letters and their numbers and they're going to school every day and there's a consistency. And it's a kind of boring, in a good way, boring consistency of learning competency and developing confidence. And then at 9, everything falls apart because then it's adolescence. So you have between 3 and 9, which is this kind of nice, stable period. So I would say by about 5 to 6, children start to be able to sleep more. So, maybe it's just that we tell mothers the wrong things. We give them expectations that aren't realistic.
And I think that goes back to what you're saying about feminism, which is, this idea that we should be able to do everything that your typical man does, forgetting that we're women and men don't have babies.
And we're so different. I mean, our nurturing behaviors that are tied to our hormones are so different than men's nurturing behaviors, which are tied to their hormones. And they're both critically important to children, but they're different. In an evolutionary way, we're made differently to fill different needs in a child's emotional life. So the idea that we're just fungible and generic and interchangeable is just, again, another myth.
So let's move from ideal into some of the real world stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I want to start with, because we're going to go down to kind of the worst case scenario.
Mm-hmm.
But, a lot of women work part-time.
Mm-hmm.
And they work in and out of the home. I mean, some women, maybe they're doing a shift, and other women in their home. Can you kind of walk us through the difference? Like, let's say the nurse who's doing part-time nursing,
mm-hmm.
so it's a 10-hour shift, versus the part-time job where maybe there's 4 or 5 hours of phone call and computer time during the day.
So I always say to mothers that the best jobs are those which they have control and flexibility over, and where they can go for short periods of time, not long periods of time. So mothers get confused that it's better to have 3 full days away from their child and then have 2 full days with their child. But actually, that's incorrect. It's better to have short. Remember, we talked about as an ideal, if your child is 2, spend 2 hours a day away from them. If they're 3, spend 3 hours a day away from them. So if you think about it, an 8 or 10 hour day, that's much more than 2 or 3. So it's almost better to really work 5 days a week, half days, than to work 3 full days. That's far better for children in terms of the idea that children can accept and then you can repair your absence, but not if it's for these long periods of time. It's just too traumatic for them.
And you mentioned repair a few times and saying goodbye. Talk to me more about if you have to leave your child, whether for work or some other obligation or grocery shopping that for whatever reason you can't bring them, what is the proper goodbye and the best repair for maximally helping that child's development?
Well, repair is the word because, we used to say if you had a hole in your sock and you darned your sock, the darning spot was stronger than the rest of the sock, right, where you darn the sock. So repair is really important. It's important that you do it as soon as possible, that you don't wait. So in other words, the reunion moments when you come home from being away are the most critical moments. So that those first moments of reunion are really important. So when mothers come in from work and they say, oh, I've got a call, or oh, I've got to go to my bedroom for a few minutes, and they say to the babysitter, you take care of the baby, I can't see the baby. I mean, if you're that baby's entire universe, then when that baby is standing at the elevator or at the front door waiting for you, that moment of reunion is a critical moment where you really are sensitive to the baby's emotions. Don't project onto the baby that they're happy, because mothers who feel guilty come home and they go, hi, baby, instead of looking at the baby and seeing what the baby's face reads. If the baby is not happy, then you mirror that baby's emotions and you say, oh, I see you're upset with mommy because mommy was gone today, but I'm here now, honey. Here I am. Right.
Do you think the mother should assume that and verbalize that? Because maybe the baby's upset because the baby has a tummy ache.
No.
So what do you recommend in terms of the verbalization of what the baby might be feeling?
If the baby is reuniting with the mother, then it's about the mother. And so look to the baby to mirror or reflect, just like looking in a mirror. If you look in a mirror, and I do this exercise with mothers who have never been mirrored themselves. There's a lot of mothers who had very narcissistic mothers themselves, and having children is really hard because no one ever really mirrored them. So they don't know how to mirror a baby because no one ever mirrored them. I literally get a mirror and have them look in a mirror with me and say, look at your face, tell me what you see. Because they often can't read the social cues. Remember, the first 3 years is a period of building the ability not only of emotional regulation and buffering from stress, but also the ability to read social cues and feel empathy. That happens in the first 3 years. If you didn't get that from your own mother, then you might not necessarily be able to give it to your own baby. So mothers will come home and just project onto the baby what they want the baby to feel, which is happy. But you have to look...
Or they're distracted and they're not even engaging with where the baby is emotionally.
Right. So if the baby's turned away from you when you come home. So there's certain things to look for in terms of attachment disorders, which I think are really important for women to know, because then they'll know that they've been away too long. And one of those is if the baby turns away from you in the reunion. Another is if the baby excessively clings to you and starts crying and won't let go of you, almost like a rhesus monkey, the rhesus monkey experiments with the wire, the fabric covering the wire. So if they cling to you like that. The other is if they look away from you and then they cling to you and then they slap you or get angry at you and they cycle through. These are attachment disorders. An avoidant attachment disorder is upon reunion if the baby turns away and prefers the nanny or seems not to want to make eye contact with you. That baby is angry at you. And that baby is saying, you weren't there for me and I don't trust you.
So in that case, and I want to, again, practical realities.
Yeah.
Is the advice to the average mother of that young child, if there's any way to not be doing this work, especially if this work is outside of this realm of ideal that we just talked through, just don't do it.
Yeah. So
is that
the ideal is if you can stay home for 3 years, that's the ideal. If I had my druthers, I would have a policy in this country that allows women to stay home for 3 years and get support. Maybe not full support, but get support from the government, get support, whether it's in the form of Social Security that they get in advance. And I don't know how we're going to do it. I have lots of good ideas that I talk to Congress people and senators about. But that would be my ideal, that every woman has the choice to stay home with their children for the first 3 years. That's the ideal.
At minimum, the choice, but then there's this other thing of responsibility.
Right.
Because I think some women may have the choice. I know many working couples, and my situation as a working mom, again, I don't want to make it too personal to me because I know I have an exceptionally unique situation that I get the flexibility that I have, and I don't want to assume other people have that. But there are individuals who just really like their work. Mm. And it's really hard for them to imagine. They're like, well, I'm just not good at the mothering thing, or I don't approach it the way maybe your other woman does. And so I'm out for X amount of hours or X amount of hours a week. And so they have maybe the choice technically, like they don't have to do the dual income. They could move or they could downsize. What would be your...
a mother who says, I'm not good at mothering has an attachment disorder. Mm-hmm.
Explain that more.
Well, she either feels she really isn't good at mothering, and that means that generationally something was missed with her, that there's pain there, because it's not instinctual. It's not unusual for women to not be interested or to be bored with other people's children. So, I love children because it's the field I chose, and I love all children. But not everybody's a therapist or a nursery school teacher, right? So if it's your profession, it's one thing, but it's anti-instinctual to not be interested in your own children.
So if you have a mother who feels she has trouble connecting with her own children,
it's a sign of postpartum depression.
Or she's disinterested with her young children, not even her baby, her 2-year-old. That's a sign of depression, or it would be a sign of an attachment disorder, or maybe both.
Postpartum depression comes out of an attachment disorder. So there's an uptick in postpartum depression. I think the statistic is something like 30% of women now, maybe even up to 40%, are developing postpartum depression. And that's as a result of attachment disorders, meaning mothering feels boring to them, even mothering their own babies. So when you have a baby, it's what I call a psychotic experience, right? This little person, this little alien grows inside of you and then pops out. And so if you think about it, if you're very healthy, you go, this is the most amazing miracle in the whole world. But it can cause literally a psychotic break in a lot of women where they don't attach to their babies, where they see the baby as foreign, like a foreign body, not as part of them, but actually as separate from them, where they don't feel connected and they actually resent this intruder. They see the baby as intrusive. And that's a sign of postpartum depression, which is the result of an attachment disorder.
But there are varying degrees of this thing, right? Because there's obviously, I've seen postpartum depression or disorder, and it can be very extreme, like lethargy, negative, horrible thoughts. Yep. Obviously, huge detachment from your own baby.
Yep.
But then I think you're speaking to something else too that I want to explore more, which is maybe they're not super depressed. Maybe they seem fine, actually. They want to go out and go running or go back to work or do whatever, go out for coffee. They just don't want to spend so much time with their baby, or they have trouble spending a lot of time with their little one because it feels overwhelming.
So there's something.
What would that be?
There's something called maternal preoccupation, which is hormonally connected, which it means that and it's natural. It's a natural connection to attaching to your baby. And we produce something called oxytocin, which is a neurotransmitter. We produce it when we are pregnant, when we give birth, and when we breastfeed. And in mothers who, so having a baby opens up a portal to your past, whether you had a very healthy connection to your own mother or you didn't. And something gets turned on or not turned on when you have a baby. Some door gets opened, and either gets opened to a past that was joyful and attached, or it gets opened to a door of loss. And so a lot of these mothers don't feel the connection to their babies because they may have had a narcissistic mother. They may have had a mother who resented mothering, or who was physically absent, or who was depressed, or
who was just weighed down. I mean, I think that a lot of, there's so many single moms today.
But a lot of them are depressed.
And a lot of them are depressed.
Yeah. So
they're overwhelmed.
It's depression. Yeah. So, so essentially, maternal preoccupation is normal. And so when we don't see it, it's that lack of empathy that we're talking about. Babies are born incredibly dependent, incredibly vulnerable, incredibly in need of you. And they're meant to turn something on in us where we feel vigilant. They're meant to turn on oxytocin. They're meant to turn on another hormone called vasopressin, which is a protective aggressive hormone. And if those don't get turned on, there's a reason for it.
So what are some studies that a mother who would like to spend more time with her child, but she feels she has to justify it to someone she's working, maybe even her spouse or her partner, about why, no, it's worth it for me to quit my job and maybe dramatically change our lifestyle, or put extra pressure on the partner, on the husband, to figure this out, or we'll figure it out together, but you've got to really be the one to pay the bills here so that I do not have to work.
So, there is an unfortunate thing. I do like to talk about reality. We used to be a country that you could have one working person and it could support the family, and it's become increasingly harder that we need two working, in certain families, two working members of the family to support the family. But I think, aside from the really practical issues of that, I think that it's really important for young women and young men to talk about these things before they have children. It's not that you can't address these things, these conflicts, once you're married and once you have a child. And again, as you say, sometimes you don't know you want to be with your child until after you have a child, meaning you make a promise to your husband and he makes a promise to you that you're going to work, and work is going to be the most important thing. You're going to make lots of money, and you love your work outside the home. And then you have a baby and it transforms you, and that door gets open to the joy of having had a wonderful experience of being a baby and having a wonderful mother. And then you want to be with your baby. And then you go back to your husband and you say, I really want to stay home. And he says, but you promised, and we bought the house and we bought the car. So I always say, prevention is worth a pound of cure. If you can talk about these issues, I want to stay home. I want the option of staying home when I have children. I want the option of working part-time when I have children. I want to take the first year off before I go back part-time. I want the option of saying I don't want to go back part-time. And so that's a really important discussion for young couples to have before they choose to have children. If it happens that you are transformed after, then I think you have to, I would say you stick to your guns as a woman, and you say, this is what's best for our child. If we need to go into couples therapy to understand that this is what's best, to understand that all relationships sometimes need to be renegotiated, all contracts sometimes need renegotiation. And if I signed a contract, I'm sorry, but I need to renegotiate it now.
Or what if we need to go into debt? Or what if we need to sell the house or move out of the city? Or
maybe we only need one car. Maybe we, maybe we can rent out a room in our house. Maybe we don't need vacations for a couple of years. Maybe we can just go to our mother-in-law's house for vacations. It's what you're willing to sacrifice for the mental health of your children. I always say it. What happens in those first 3 years casts such a long shadow on the rest of your child's life and on the rest of your life. Because again, if your child's not happy and healthy, you're not happy and healthy. So if you think of it in those terms, then you say whatever sacrifices we have to make in those first 3 years are worth it.
EveryLife.com is America's pro-life baby product company. Diapers and wipes, which are ethically sourced, high-quality products from a company that supports your pro-life values and donates back to the pro-life movement. I love EveryLife.com. This is the company. If you're listening, you've got a baby in your life, you've got a niece or a nephew, you've got a kid, this is the company to use the diapers and wipes from. You can go to EveryLife.com today. You can order a trial package or you can order a subscription. Again, fantastic quality, ethically sourced. It's going to be great for your little one. EveryLife.com, and you can use the code Lila at checkout for 10% off your order. That's EveryLife.com and Lila at checkout for 10% off your order.
Another question about practical realities. In family court, in the case of divorce or separation, often custody is given kind of de facto 50-50, including for very young children.
I fight this. I do expert testimony around the country, so I know exactly what you're talking about.
What are your thoughts? And then also, children who are in foster care, that's another aspect of this, are moved around, sometimes very frequently at very young ages. Let's start with custody disputes, divorce settlements.
So I think that the courts are incredibly ignorant. I think most judges are incredibly ignorant about attachment security. I've had judges on cases that I've worked on laugh about it and say, hold babies on their lap and say, oh, look at this baby, he'll attach to anybody. I mean, just complete and total ignorance and insensitivity and lack of empathy. And so I think we need to educate the court system, including the judges, particularly the judges, as to the fact that, this idea of, 50-50 is never even Steven. And so 50-50 may be a way to describe we're both very involved in that child. So we're both equally involved in that child's life. But in terms of the overnights and breastfeeding, I've had mothers who are breastfeeding 3-month-old babies where the judge says 50-50 to the father. Now the baby sleeps, no breastfeeding, let's bottle feed. It's just so cruel, incredibly ignorant, incredibly frustrating for me. That there is such a lack of sensitivity and understanding that babies are not a sack of potatoes. They are not a vase that can be passed from one house to another. They're human beings with an incredibly fragile neurological system, and they cannot be treated like a sack of potatoes.
Another practical reality for many women, we talked about this to some extent, but curious your take on that. This motherhood can feel isolating or lonely. The suburban, we're in our little house, at least feet from other houses. I might not even know my neighbors. I don't really walk anywhere during the day. I don't really see anyone in my average daily routine. I'm in this house for most of the day, unless I go to the park or maybe the grocery store, but there's not a village I'm interacting with on a daily basis as part of my routine. Maybe once a week I'll see a friend or talk to a family member or see a family member. Many women choose to go back to work because it is emotionally and intellectually stimulating.
I mean, I understand. We say in New York, Robert Moses was the destruction of families.
Interesting.
Because he invented the suburbs outside of New York. And, it's not how we're meant to raise children.
So to that woman who, let's say, separate from economic realities, she's just struggling.
Mm-hmm.
What recommendations would you give to her about how she can, and is part of her struggle, when is the struggle, I'm not raising my child in a village, versus the struggle is it's attachment disorder I have from the way that I was raised?
Well,
and maybe it's both for many women.
Here's an interesting question, is because normally I would say to that woman, form your own communities. Get together the mothers in your neighborhood. And, if you're not invited to a party, have a party yourself and invite everybody else. And, everybody's feeling like you are. So organize a mother's group 3 times a week or every morning. You do a mother's group every morning. You have a routine. You all get together. You go to each other's houses with the babies. They used to call them coffee clutches or in the 1950s, but churches, synagogues, faith-based communities. If you live in the suburbs, get attached to your church. Find a way to start a mother's group in your church, I think the idea is that if you're not invited to a party, make a party. But you can't be alone because we're not meant to be alone. That's what I would say to those mothers.
And in the ideal, I know there's a ton of moms who do side hustles, part-time jobs, gigs, work from home. And in the ideal for the economic sake of the family, it could be we're getting together with our other young working mom coworker, and we're doing this thing as a project. And it's not, again, it's a limited time. So I'm still with my baby, but I'm doing this creative work. It's bringing in some resources. It's kind of like the description that you had earlier.
Absolutely.
It's the modern version of going to the field with the baby on the back and the 2-year-old with other women with their babies on the back and their 2-year-old, and you're doing something economically important for the household. Because I do think
it's called social entrepreneurship. It's called social entrepreneurship. And in other countries, that's what it's called. And absolutely, entrepreneurship, women are capable. I'm going to say this. Women and men are not the same. Women are incredibly capable of entrepreneurship because they're capable of multitasking, and they're capable of holding various aspects and relationships in their mind at the same time, simultaneously. And so they're very, very expert entrepreneurs. And so the idea of forming co-ops like they do in other countries, or, that, in fact, that's what Avon ladies and Tupperware parties. And, the idea was, how can we make money, but be with our children and do something in the community? And it's the creativity, I think. I would say that women were never really meant to be in the corporate world. And that's a very radical thing to say. But the corporate world was designed by men, for men, about men. And so when the women's rights movement came along, we all wanted to be like men instead of being the best women we could be. And that's unfortunate because there's many, many ways in which we can be productive outside the home and bring in money and be in helping professions. What they used to call women's work was the best kind of work because it gave you control and flexibility. If you were a nurse, if you were a teacher, if you were a speech therapist, if you were a psychotherapist, or being an entrepreneur where you have control and flexibility. But working 9 to 5 in a company was really designed for men.
Do you think that it is really good for men too, to do that? Do you think that that's good for men? Obviously, the economy's shifting and, the gig economy is changing.
It is
changing.
I would say that it's probably not good for anyone to work 10 to 12 hours a day in an office. I don't think it's good for their health. I don't think it's good for their relationships. And I think you're right. I think it's shifting. So men have other ways of working and thinking about work. So,
but the point you're making is that men and women are different, and men can go off for 8, maybe up to 10, but significant chunks of time away from the family. And historically, there's been a degree that this has happened, let's say in the fields or the shop, and there's a significant amount of time
or hunting. Men went off to hunt for sometimes weeks at a time in tribal communities. They still do, and they come back, and but the women hold down the fort, and they take care of the children. So there have always been, in an evolutionary way, different roles, and our hormones influence our nurturing behaviors. There are many men now who want to have closer relationships with their children. And I think that's wonderful, because fathers are necessary to children, particularly to little boys, but to all children. And but I think fathers are more capable of spending more time away from their children. Whereas mothers, when they spend more time away from their children, it disrupts that attachment security. Unless the father is the primary attachment figure, which in some cases happens today, it's not impossible, but
can that work within the ideal?
It can. What I would say is that because mothers and fathers' nurturing behaviors are so different, tied to hormones, then you have to at least educate a father about sensitive empathic nurturing, because fathers' response to distress is different in young children than mothers' response. Fathers distract. So when fathers produce oxytocin, when mothers produce oxytocin, it makes them sensitive, empathic nurturers, so it makes them tune into the distress of the baby. When fathers produce oxytocin, because they stay home, and they produce higher levels of oxytocin, it makes them more playful, tactile stimulators of babies, like throwing the baby up in the air and tickling the baby and running around and encouraging the baby to explore and be resilient. And it's just not what very young children need. It's what slightly older children need to separate. But that early attachment, so you have to teach fathers, no, the baby doesn't need you to tickle them and jiggle them and throw them up in the air. They need you to hold them and soothe them and talk to them quietly and give them skin to skin and take off your shirt when you're bottle feeding them. And it's possible. It's just we have to then, first you have to acknowledge that we're not the same, and then you can educate fathers.
But back to the ideal, even in that scenario you're describing where the father maybe is more naturally empathetic anyways and willing to do the stay-at-home thing and wanting to do it.
Yeah.
And he's willing to train himself kind of hormonally to manage the cues of the child and be there, really be there, being there, like your book is. But the mother gone for 8 to 10 hours, what's going on with her that she's comfortable being a woman, being the mother, with leaving her infant for 8 to 10 hours? That would speak to possibly an attachment disorder or some other issues she's facing. So even then, even in the case where it's working, he's doing great, the kids seem to be doing pretty well, what's going on with her?
Well, again, what I would say is that maternal this is the way I'll say it, and that way it's not judgmental. Maternal preoccupation is very healthy, and it's very normal. And if you don't have it, it means something.
And maternal preoccupation
means you want to be with your baby more than you want to be doing anything else when you have a young baby.
And if as a woman you don't experience maternal preoccupation as you defined it, then what should she do?
Get help. Go see a therapist.
And see a therapist.
Talk about the fact that she doesn't feel that, she can't feel that, she doesn't feel as drawn to her baby as she does to her work.
Or whatever other pursuit.
So that if you really struggle financially or you're a single mom, what I say is children benefit from their mothers feeling sad when they can't be with them. A mother who feels sad and feels remorse actually is more likely to be able to repair their absence with a child. And the child is more likely to forgive the mother. If the child really feels that the mother really wants to be. I can give you an example of that. So my nanny that we had for our children, who was really more like a mother's helper because I worked, as I said, the 2 hours a day. But she was there with me. I had 3 kids, and we would do it together. We'd go to the park together. When she was raising children, she couldn't be with her children. She was a single mother, and her husband left her, and she had 3 children. And what helped her in her relationship with her children is her children felt her sadness, and she told them about her sadness, and they shared that. And she would repair it every day. She'd come home and say, I missed you today, and I really wanted to be with you, and I'm so sad I couldn't be with you. I'm here now. And so that helped the children to forgive. It's the mothers who really say, either consciously or unconsciously to their children, and children can feel it, I really would rather be someplace else. And those mothers aren't bad people. Those mothers there's something in their own childhood. There was neglect. There was a narcissistic mother. There was abuse. There was something happened to those children to interrupt that instinct.
I want to ask this question again. We've kind of covered it, but in maybe a different way, because it's so controversial today. People don't want to believe that the answer to this question could possibly be no. And it is, are men and women, are mothers and fathers biologically interchangeable for a young child?
No, not at all.
And so that young child needs a mother. And does that young child need a father, but it needs the mother more?
It needs a mother and a father. So we could do a whole other show about why fathers are important, because fathers are necessary, because mothers regulate emotions like sadness and distress and fear. Fathers regulate aggression, and they regulate excitement. And so, particularly for little boys, if they don't have fathers, they don't learn to regulate aggression, and they often end up with things like behavioral issues and early signs of aggressive behavioral issues, right? So the idea is that fathers model how to regulate aggression for little boys.
When you say little boy, how old are you speaking?
Toddlers.
2, 3.
Yeah. So essentially, fathers start out with infants. They attach to infants, not like mothers do, but they have a relationship. And today, in particular, there's definitely an encouragement of having a very loving relationship with your infant. But it's not until children really begin to separate that fathers become really important, because they seduce the baby away from the mother. What we're finding is there's so many mothers who are single mothers by choice today.
What do you mean by that?
It means that they go to sperm banks and they have children on their own, and so we know that those children are having trouble separating. So in our practices, we're seeing more children with separation issues because they may attach fully to those mothers. They may be sleeping with those mothers far too long because the mothers attach to those children almost as partners. I mean, if you are a single mother and you don't have a partner that you're raising your child with, that what can happen is you can, take that baby into your bed and you say, right, I'm so attached to this baby. But you also need, so there are 2 books that John Bowlby wrote. John Bowlby was the father of attachment theory. He had a big book on attachment. He had another big book on separation. And the truth is they're both important. You could say mothers are the objects of attachment and fathers are the objects of separation. Fathers lure babies away from mothers in a healthy way and say, come on, come out and play. The weather's fine. Let's go. Take some risks. It's okay to go on the monkey bars. And right? Because mothers are very vigilant about safety and, right, they get very vigilant. Fathers are less vigilant. And so they're both necessary, but they're not the same. And the problem is if you ask a single parent, whether it's a mother or a father, to fulfill both of those roles, that's very complicated to fulfill both of those roles.
What is in the practical reality universe, what would be your advice to someone who is working full-time, and they're both working full-time, the 2 spouses, and they plan to pull back, and so maybe they're going to go to part-time, but how would you recommend the calculus of, we talked about the 1 to 2 to 3 hour rubric, in terms of providing other material opportunities or things for the child. So, for example, because I do this work and maybe it's not 2 hours, I'm gone 4 or 5, but now we can afford to live close to the biological parents. These are the kind of decisions that are being made, the grandparents or now we can afford to, send you to this school that we know is going to be really important for you in a couple of years, or we're saving up to actually buy our home so we know we have this level of security that we wouldn't have otherwise. Any recommendations on those sorts of those pragmatic decisions that people are making every single day?
Yeah.
Like pushing the envelope. We're not going to, the 2 hours feels really strict. We're going to do 5, but it means these other things for our family.
What I would say is I would still prioritize your physical and emotional presence over any of those things. Again, I understand. And there is a number. I think there's actually a financial number. There's studies to show if you make this much money as a family in America, then you are in another category. And I can't remember, and it's probably a different number according to different parts of the country. So I don't want to judge parents who are making very, very hard decisions. There are some very hard decisions families have to make. But what I will say to you is children don't care about the school they go to. They don't care about the house they live in. They don't care about the car they drive. They don't care about vacations. They don't care about nicer clothes. They're happy to wear hand-me-downs. Just if you're there for them in those early years.
I want to go now to the harm. You mentioned daycare a few times at the beginning of the interview and the harm that is to child. Can you walk us through some of the research on the harm of leaving your child for more than the 2-3 hours a day to the extreme of 8 to 12 hours a day?
So daycare, the children in daycare have higher salivary cortisol levels. So they test their salivary cortisol levels, the stress hormones. They have higher stress hormone levels. And the research shows that children who are put in daycare at too early an age have higher levels of behavioral problems, early signs of aggression, and ADHD-like symptoms later on in the school years. That's what the research shows.
And this is daycare for how many hours?
Again, I can't give a specific number, but we say less is more in this case. So I usually say more is more because more is more in terms of presence. But you would say no daycare, in my opinion, is good daycare. In California, you are the ones who started this Share the Care movement, which is if you can't afford a babysitter who is going to be consistent. You remember that when you put your child in daycare, you're putting them in a group setting with transient daycare workers who are underpaid, undertrained, overwhelmed, and often absent. So there's a lot of absenteeism in daycare workers because they get overwhelmed. So, and the best way I can describe it to you is the ratios in daycare are usually not less than 5 to 1, sometimes 8 to 1. In Sweden, they're 12 to 1. And if you have a daycare worker that's out, even in America, it can be 8 to 1. And so I want you to imagine, every mother who's listening to this, I want you to imagine whether you would have the ability as a daycare worker to soothe even 5 babies who are in distress from moment to moment, to regulate their emotions and get them back to homeostasis and make them feel secure. Inevitably, you would lose your mind and you'd end up taking days off. And those babies would be in like transient care, in care with many different people. And also the wear and tear on those daycare workers means they don't last for very long. But the most important thing is you're putting your very neurologically fragile child in a group environment that's overstimulating, has too many people, too much noise, too many environmental stimulus, too many people coming in and coming out. And so that's not what babies need. Quiet, calm, peaceful, playful, secure environments. And I can't emphasize enough that daycare is not that.
What's your advice for single moms who feel this is...
Grab a friend and live. If I really want to say what my advice is, live with your best friend who's also a single mom. Grab 1 or 2 other single moms and get a group house and live with your children together. There was a great book by Anita Diamant called The Red Tent. It was a biblical book. It was about the sister, with the book? It was about whose daughter? One of the Jacob's daughters, the one that's never talked about. And And basically, it was a book that talked about, in biblical times, women lived in red tents with their children. They raised their children together. There were women, they lived in group environments. If you don't have extended family, you make an extended family. And that will be your family. And you can even share caregiving. Maybe you say, I'll work on Monday, Wednesday, and Fridays. You work on Tuesday and Thursdays. You watch the kids on Monday and Wednesdays. I'll watch the kids on Tuesday.
We'll all pay the rent.
We'll all pay the rent, and we'll cook dinner together. We'll raise our children together. And, community, not isolation.
It's a powerful thing you're recommending, replacing all the daycares, because there are a lot of single moms. I think the number is 1/4 of all children are being raised by single moms today. And, all different circumstances that they're facing. And imagine if they all had this sort of, system set up to really be there for each other. Obviously, that doesn't mean people that outside of the single mom group shouldn't be helping single moms and supporting them. That work of raising a child is some of the most important work you could do in the world. But I think it would, do you think that would radically change developmental outcomes for kids?
Radically. I also think that if people hired babysitters or nannies, it's more consistent, meaning when you hire someone, first of all, you know who you're getting because you picked them. You have a close relationship with them. You don't have a close relationship with your daycare workers. These are strangers to you, really, who smile at you when you come in, and you have no close relationship. These are close relationships, the people who come into your house, what I call come into your underwear drawers and fold your laundry for you. You have a very close relationship with them, and they're consistent. You get somebody who's going to be with you for years, who's going to have an investment in your child, who's not just there in a transitory way, but who's going to be invested in your child, and share the cost of that caregiver with another family.
This has been so powerful, and I'm sure a lot of people listening have all kinds of questions about, okay, what do I do now? Maybe it's just triggered something in them that they think, okay, the situation, the way we're doing our child raising right now is a problem. Or maybe I'm walking into a danger zone because I want to get married and have kids, or I'm about to get married and have kids, and my life is not set up for what you're describing to pursue that ideal. What are some resources? I'm going to start with the women who are working or part-time or full-time, who just the idea of staying home with their kids all day long sounds really hard. Mm-hmm. What is some practical advice that you have for them for how they can overcome maybe what is going on in their own childhoods or their own mental health or emotional health, in addition to maybe the lack of community that they're experiencing? How can they?
Join a mother's group. First thing. Join a mother's group. As soon as your baby has gotten its shots, which is about 8 weeks, join a mother's group and get together with those mothers on a regular basis. If you can get a therapist who leads the mother's group, hire a therapist. Share the cost of a therapist to come in and lead the group. And the other days when the therapist is not there, then get together anyway with your babies and sit on the floor. And the issue really that's happened in our country is that so many mothers go to work that the mothers who stay at home feel even more isolated because they don't have a community. They have nannies or daycare workers. I mean, who do they have to form these groups with? So find other women, like-minded women, form communities of like-minded women. There's an organization that I love called Big Ocean Women out of Salt Lake City, Utah. A woman named Carolina Allen, she formed it, and it's basically a resource. It's women's groups all over the world. It formed mothers groups, mothers getting together, talking about mothering and supporting one another. That's the T-shirt I have that says Maternal Feminism comes from them. But the idea that you have to find like-minded women of a similar value system. I mean, isn't that always the way? We have to find like-minded people of a similar value system who share our values and then form mothers groups.
And those mothers groups, I think a lot of women do have some sort of a mothers group. Maybe it's once a week.
Not enough.
How many times a week?
Structure it. Have it be every coffee clutches. That's what they did in the 50s.
Start your day with coffee.
Start your day with coffee with moms. It's what
and find the moms you share values with, so that they're not boring. Or
every day,
you feel connected.
Every day, form a structure, form a routine every day.
And then what about those mothers who are struggling to be to want, even if they have the community, they're still struggling to want to be with their kids. Their work is really interesting. They really love.
They like the intellectual stimulation.
They love it.
Then think of it as titrating it, meaning know that life is long and you'll be successful in your career. I mean, if we all live till 120 like Moses, which I think, with science and technology the way it is, we probably all will live till 120. You have 3 years to really create this foundation for your child's mental health and personality, right? But you may have 70 years to work in your life. So don't think of it as a linear process of working. Think of it as, what can I do now to stay involved in my career, but not be so driven in it? Think of it as regulating your own excitement about your work. So you do a little bit of it, but you don't need to do it in an intense way. And as your children get older, then you pick it up and you do it more intensely. But yeah, that's my best advice, would be to find a way to do it in a very regulated way. That's maybe not that, maybe you're not famous in your field. Maybe you're not making tons of money, but at least you're keeping your toe in your work, and you know that for later on, you'll be able to return to it.
For those 2 to 3 hours a day.
Yeah.
Or whatever it might be.
Right.
Okay. And then I'm sure there's someone listening right now who they have a 4 or 5 or 6-year-old. And those first 3 years are gone. And they're thinking, I made so many mistakes. And my kid seems okay.
Mm-hmm.
They're not like, we have a good relationship. What would be your advice to them?
Well, what I would say is some kids are okay. So, but a lot of kids don't show the signs that they're not okay until they hit adolescence. So there are certain vulnerable points in development where children break down, and one of those points is adolescence. So, meaning if things happen in the first 3 years, sometimes those issues will submerge and not come out and be repressed until adolescence, because adolescence is a kind of trauma that opens up, vulnerability again. And a lot of the things that happen, that's what my second book is about adolescence, because adolescence is the second critical window of brain development, where a lot of the same things are happening that happened in 0 to 3. Mm-hmm. So you have a second chance. So the second book was called Second Chances, and they didn't
awesome.
take that. They didn't take my title for that one either. It's called Chicken Little, the Sky Isn't Falling.
Come on.
Raising
Second Chances is a much
second
better
chances.
title, Erica.
But the truth is that you have, so the brain is plastic, meaning you have an opportunity to try to repair things with your child at any point, as long as they're still under your roof. The truth is that the prefrontal cortex doesn't stop developing. The emotional regulating part of the brain doesn't stop developing till 25 in women, till 28 in men. So technically you have until then to influence your children. But once they move out of the house, you've lost a lot of your influence.
I'm going to guess you would say don't boot your kid at 18 automatically.
No, absolutely. Again, that could be a whole other...
That's your third book.
Yeah. But
keep them till 25 to 28.
Well, but I mean, some kids aren't ready.
And you said, just to clarify, you said the female's brain is not fully developed till 25 and the male's 28.
Up to 28, yeah.
And so, and that's continuing or completing the process that was opened up during adolescence.
Right.
So you really have a decade plus of adolescence.
You do. But
where
they're
close
under your
bonds with the parent can be very, very influential.
Very important. But obviously you have more influence when they're under your roof. So I would say take advantage of up till 18 or 19 when they're still living with you. The way our culture is, many move out after that, either to go to college or get a job or whatever. So, take advantage of those 18 years to repair it at whatever point you enter in is a good point to enter.
Better than nothing.
Better than nothing. And a lot can be repaired. You'd be surprised how much can be repaired.
And what about someone listening who is not at the adolescent stage yet? They have that younger child and they're in the maybe submerged years. You use that word, they're submerged. So the things that might have gone wrong in those first 3 years will not really appear as obvious until adolescence. Any advice for how they can, maybe this child's in school now, maybe that mom's back at work or she's always been at work, things seem okay. What can that mom do to maximize the bond and the attachment?
Transitions. Be there for as many of those transitions in your child's life as possible. So if you work, I always think when children go to school, primary school in America is 6 to 7 hours a day. It's actually a long day for a little kid.
Too long?
No, it's for 7-year-olds, 6 hours, but by the time, they're finished, it's probably 6 to 7 hours. That's a long time to work. That's a lot of hours to work. So, the other thing is that women can also organize their work around their children's work. So if you say that Maria Montessori said children don't play, they work. I think they play and they need to play. But their work is school. And so when they're in school, that gives you all those hours to work. So if you can organize your work around their work, that's what women used to do. They used to drop their kids off. They used to drop their kids off at school. They'd work for 6 hours, and then they'd pick them up from school, and they'd make cookies, and they'd help them with the transition back to home. And that would be the time that your children were most vulnerable and shared with you what happened during the day, because if you don't catch them in the transitions, they close up like clams.
And to clarify, this is for the youngest, but really 5-year-olds that you're talking about going off to school. And the 4-year-old, you would say maybe go to school for 4 hours.
Yeah.
Not much more.
I would say most preschools in America, by the time they're between 4 and 5, they do between 4 and 5 hours a day, 5 days a week, as getting them ready. And you don't have to do that. Preschool is optional, but I would say, no more than that. No after school, no, and if I would say less is more. Less is more.
Homeschool moms. There's homeschool moms listening who are like, okay, good. I'm there, and I'm there at 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Is it optimal? Is it back to the ideal? Is school part of the ideal? Going to a school at 6 years old for 6 to 7 hours, going to a school at 8 years old for up to 8 hours. Is that optimal?
So it depends on the child, because there are some children that benefit and do well in social environments when it comes to preschool. When it comes to primary school. And there are other children who are neurodivergent, who are have developmental issues, who may have something just that's a little bit different about them physically or emotionally, and they can suffer a lot. So it depends on the child. I think some children actually really benefit from homeschooling if they're struggling socially, and if kids are doing well socially, then school's a good thing. So it really depends on the child. But I think this idea that one size fits all, and we take a square peg and we stick it in a round hole, and we take a hammer and we hit the hammer until the square peg, which is how we think about school. And so a lot of kids suffer because the kids who are neurodivergent, or the kids who have, other physical attributes that make them different, or maybe they're on the spectrum, or, those kids actually are often really tortured in school. And so those kids actually tend to do better if they're homeschooled. And then if, as part of the homeschooling, they have a community. So I never, ever recommend homeschooling in isolation, because children need to separate from their parents, but they can be homeschooled and still separate from their parents, but they need a community. They need other adults. In other words, if it's only all the time with your parents, that's not good for children. But if they have a community of other kids that they get together with on a regular basis, or learn with, or other parents who are teaching them too, it sort of creates a community. I guess the key is really community.
Any advice for scripts or things that you recommend moms or women can say, not just we talked about the husbands or the partners earlier, but to people who question their choices? I know there is some shaming of stay-at-home moms to some degree. Weirdly, I think feminism, unfortunately, it's one of the toxic implications of feminism, that you're less than if you just stay at home. You're not doing as interesting things. I think there's a sense of judgment that some women feel for being passionately committed to, I'm going to make sacrifices, and our family's going to make sacrifices, so I'm physically at home. That's my whole job.
I think I've always thought that's a kind of projected guilt. So in other words, the women who don't enjoy being with their children, or don't want to be with their children.
I think there's a secret longing there that's not...
Well, I think there's conflict. I think there's a lot of conflict, and conflict means that there's aggression. And that aggression gets projected onto women who stay at home and it could also be envy, secret unconscious envy, because those women really enjoy being with their children. And so the idea is that you envy what you can't be or who you aren't. And so part of it may be that some of that aggression that they feel, some of that conflict they feel is projected onto those women who stay at home. And I think some of it's also envy. I don't know if that helps those women because I do know that, you go to a cocktail party, this is what I always hear. And this is, again,
what do you do?
Yeah, what do you do? And then once you say, I raise my children, everybody turns away and turns, right? And so I think we all need to be aware of that, and that raising children is probably the most important job anyone can do.
It is.
Because in the end, society depends upon healthy children that grow into healthy, responsible, loving adults. And so there is nothing more important than raising children. And so somehow we've gotten it. So Freud said that to be happy, you need love and meaningful work. He always said love first. But in our society, we've turned it around. You need work and maybe some love.
You mentioned earlier, and I want to close with this because, this has been amazing, Erica, and I know people listening, there's been so many aha moments. You mentioned earlier the mother groups and community and the importance for mothers to have these things to deal with maybe the temptation to just want to go back to work because it's so boring or whatever it is. They lack that community aspect. But back to, you mentioned, we were just talking about the woman that maybe she's judging the other woman for being the stay-at-home mom because she, looks down on a mother so invested moment by moment in her child. It feels smothering to her. Or maybe there's a deep envy that she can't enjoy it the way that mother is. How can a woman rediscover her maternal instinct? Which, by the way, I think would have been a great title for that first book.
I think that you can't do it on your own. You have to get help. You have to start to uncover old losses and old kind of wounds, because basically if we have traumas and losses and conflicts from our childhood, it's not like you bury them and they're gone. You bury them and so we say in my field, repression is a wonderful defense if it lasted a lifetime, but it rarely ever does. And so you need to uncover those losses. You need to uncover that pain. And that's the only way you get better. You can't just skate over superficially and hope that things are going to get better another day. You really have to go back and you have to look at your own childhood, and you have to look at the relationship you had with your own mother, because the basis on which we form our relationship with our children, for good, for bad, is the relationship we had with our own mother. And if it wasn't perfect, as most relationships with our mothers aren't, then we go back and we look at it and we resolve the conflicts we had about it. And then we become better mothers as a result.
But what if, it is a fact, most people, they don't remember anything from those first 3 years. Maybe they have some good childhood memories. They still don't enjoy mothering, though. Or they enjoy aspects of it, but it's overwhelming. It's not, they don't seem to experience that same enjoyment that other women they perceive have. How does one really grieve something they don't remember?
Well, you actually, when you go into therapy, you start to remember. It's an interesting thing. It starts to turn the lights on again.
So make space to remember.
Yeah. And you can't do it alone, because if you could say that you're not mothered alone, and my colleagues would probably kill me for saying this, but what I do is I give women a therapeutic experience that is an emotionally reparative experience. So it's like being remothered.
Do you think that's key?
Yeah.
Is experiencing mothering from a woman who is like a surrogate mother.
It is.
The mothering you didn't have.
It is.
So you know how to give it to someone else then.
And so you feel loved yourself. I mean, most women who can't love their children did not feel loved by their mothers in one way or shape or form. And that doesn't mean that on some perfunctory level, they didn't think you ask most women, they say, oh, my mother loved me. But if you really dig deep into the details, you find that, well, my mother was kind of resentful. Well, my mother really would rather be not there. And my mother, she was forced to be a mother and,
Or she was busy.
Or she was busy, or she was
find that a lot,
distracted, or she was
distracted,
depressed, or she was very narcissistic. So, you just have to scratch a little below the surface and you find a great deal.
Erica, this has been awesome. Thank you so much. Where can people find your work and read your excellent books?
www.komisar, KOMISAR.com, and you can see a lot of things on my website. You can see the books, you can order the books, but you can also see all of the articles I've written on different topics.
Any final thoughts you want to leave us with?
I would say to women who are struggling with this that it's raising children is the hardest thing that you'll ever do. It's also the most rewarding thing that you'll ever do. And if you're questioning it, allow yourself to question it. If you're feeling guilty, allow yourself to feel guilty. Allow yourself to explore these feelings now while you still can and while you can still make a difference in the relationship with your children.
One more question, actually. I should have asked this earlier. You talked about guilt earlier. There may be people feeling guilty right now. You said guilt is a sign of something. Explore it. Don't just run from it.
Right.
Is it possible to feel guilt for something that's not wrong, but there's something else going on there? And in your experience, based on what you know of our culture and your clients, how often is the guilt a true sign of something wrong that needs to be explored versus it's the mommy guilt that every mother has to some degree or another?
So all guilt is healthy. It's not something to run away from. If it's excessive, it's unhealthy. So if you have a woman who is always feeling anxious that she's not doing enough, but she is, that would be a sign of it's about intensity and degree. So there are many mothers who are wonderful mothers who just never feel that they're good enough. But again, that has very little to do with mothering and has much more to do with self-esteem and feeling good enough inside as a person. So again, those are older. There's a wonderful article called Ghosts in the Nursery. Those are older and deeper ghosts to grapple with.
But generally speaking, the guilt of a mom is a healthy sign.
It's a sign of vigilance. It's a sign of
something to resolve.
Yeah, it's a sign of your conscience working. It's a sign of feeling vigilant around your baby. It's a sign of preoccupation with your baby. And you do not want to turn away from those feelings. Those are important feelings. If it's excessive and it's making you feel anxious, you need to get help with it.
Erica, thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah.
This has been awesome. Everyone, definitely pick up Erica's book. I like your original title, but it's called Being There. And I'm excited to, I hope, do this again and talk about your other book, because I'm not in the adolescence phase with my kids and I haven't even read that book yet. But I think this first step of Being There is the foundation for those first 3 years. So thank you so much, Erica.
You're so welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Lila Rose podcast. Wow, what a great conversation that was with Erica. I felt that I learned a lot, even more from the book. I mean, getting to talk to her in person is such a privilege because you get to actually engage with the ideas that she presents in the book in more specific level of detail and ask those practical questions. I'm sure this opened up a lot of food for thought for people listening. I want to hear what you think. Please email me at lila@gtbmedia.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can always leave a comment on the YouTube channel. You can, of course, always leave a review. Please give us 5 stars if you listen on Spotify or on Apple. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already to the YouTube channel and to the podcast. It helps the podcast reach more people. And also feel free to reach out to Erica. You got her website. It'll be linked in the bio as well. But she's doing an amazing and unique work because her voice and what she has to say is in some ways unpopular. It's not heard a lot, but I think it's very, very important because at the end of the day, what is most important? What's most important is our kids. What's most important is the bonds of love that we have with each other. And I want to just send this message to myself, to moms listening. You are enough as a mother to mother your kids. And your child is enough as a child to deserve your full attention and your love. And I don't think that any woman should feel bad because of the pressures from whether it's feminism or society or whatever else, to really want to be and do everything in her power to really be there for her baby. So thank you again to Erica for such a compelling episode. Send me your thoughts. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time.